In 1591, there were a lot of interesting things that took place. And if I were to go through a list of those things, you probably wouldn't remember any of them, because there were a lot of different battles that took place between like Spain and England and countries like that. Queen Elizabeth I was in her rule in England, and there were some kings that killed some other kings, and it was just kind of a barbaric time to be alive. The United States in 1591 was not a country yet. As a matter of fact, the Mayflower had not even landed on the shores of the future United States. There's been a lot that's taken place since then. For example, we've seen the development of a railroad. There wasn't a railroad in 1591. We've seen the development of a rifle, of an electric light. We've seen the development of motor cars, airplanes, computers. We've gone to space, and we've done so much more. Now we can communicate via the internet with anyone around the world at any point. And electricity, it's not just in light bulbs anymore. Now you can get a car that can go 300 miles and close to 200 miles an hour. That is an electric car. Even in the last 100 years, since 1951, well, that's been less than 100 years, but since 1951, it feels like we've come a long way. How about 1591? We have come a really long way. In 430 years. When you put it in perspective like that, 430 years feels like a long time to us. 1591 feels like forever ago. It doesn't feel like it was any time recent. So in Exodus chapter 12, when we learn that Israel spent 430 years in Egypt, it starts to sink in how long they were there, with a hugely significant amount of that time being in bondage. We find ourselves in Exodus chapter 1. And what we're going to see is that Joseph has died. This happens at the end of Genesis chapter 50. And we get to Exodus chapter 1, and we see that a Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph, and he says, these Israelite people are crazy. Let's make them our servants. And the Egyptians forced the Israelites into slavery. And it says the children of Israel continued to multiply, and the harder the Egyptians worked them, the more they multiplied. And the Israelites are stuck. Egypt has them as slaves, and they are miserable. They needed a deliverer. Verse 14 of this passage points out, and it says, we'll start in verse 13. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their life bitter with hard service, in mortar and bricks, and in all kinds of work in the field, and all the work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So here are the children of Israel. These children who are God's chosen people, and they're in Egypt, and they're working as slaves in the hot African sun. They were bitter, they were miserable. And so when we get to chapter 2, verse 23, and we see the children of Israel groaning for deliverance, I think we can understand why. Verse 23 says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. They say, you know what? We need deliverance. We need saved from where we are. The word deliverance means this idea of this action of being rescued or set free. And that's what the children of Israel are trying to call out for. And in this video, what I want our goal to be is to seek one deliverance. to seek that one deliverance that is going to allow us to understand how we need to be delivered, the reason we need to be delivered, and eventually from where we are now to where we're going to be delivered to. And so I want us to look at the children of Israel, and we're just going to kind of walk through a little bit of who they are for just a moment, because what we're going to find is I want us to discover, why do the children of Israel need to be delivered? Now, to you and I, this is a common reason. We would say, well, look at them, they're in bondage. There is a clear reason and an obvious reason they need to be delivered. And I would say that most people on planet Earth, outside a few people who still live in a barbaric or evil culture, would say that it is very clear that the children of Israel need to be delivered. They would say it's very clear that people don't need to be in slavery. Even unbelievers, and God would say that this is wrong, and that this group of people, this nation, who's enslaved for simply being a certain nation, needs to be delivered from that slavery. But for the Israelites, I'm not sure that they even realized that they needed to be delivered. Now, that's kind of a weird thing to say. Let's talk about it for just a minute. I hope you still have your Bibles open, and I hope you're in chapter 2. Because what we're going to notice is we're going to see in the start of chapter 2, this guy named Moses is born. Moses is a little bit world famous. And Moses is born, and he goes and he's in the Pharaoh's house, and he grows up in the Pharaoh's house, super educated, and he's sitting there watching the children of Israel get killed. Verse 11, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He knew he was a Hebrew. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. This passage is fascinating. It says, when Moses has grown up, so when he's sitting here as an adult, he sits there and says, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rescue my people. I'm going to stand strong. I'm going to be the person who saves you. What's verse 13 say? So he kills this Egyptian, right? And this Egyptian, he buries him in the sand. He says, you know what I just did? I just saved that Israelite from getting beat by this Egyptian. Verse 13. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid, and he thought, surely this thing is known. Moses walked out the next day thinking, hey, look at me. I just killed an Egyptian yesterday. I'm on your team. Let me be the prince over you, the ruler over you. Let me be your hero, your deliverer. Let me be the guy who's going to do this for you, my people. And he walks up to these guys and expects them to say, oh, Moses, thank you for killing the Egyptian yesterday. Thank you for being our prince and our ruler. You are wonderful, Moses. And instead, they look at him and they say, hey, get out of here, you murderer. Why do you have a right to judge us? It's a very fascinating thing. And I think that these men who are sitting here, and they can look at Moses and know he's educated, know he has been raised in the Egyptian palace as somebody who could actually deliver them. And they don't sit there and say, oh, Moses, thank goodness you're here. You can now deliver us. No, they sit here and say, what are you doing here? We don't want you here. Get out. It's almost like they had developed a complacency in bondage. And even though they probably weren't sitting there saying, you know what, I'm enjoying this bond. I'm enjoying this slavery. This is fun. That's not what they're thinking. But you can imagine that they might be sitting there thinking to themselves, you're not the guy, and we're fine. Get over it. And it's interesting because it really does almost seem like the children of Israel have developed this we're fine, it's whatever type attitude, even though they are miserable. See, when bondage is all you know, escaping bondage doesn't seem as important. Remember we talked about 430 years ago. We're going to find out, like I said in chapter 12, that the Israelites were in bondage for 430 years. And so we went back to 1591 and thought about how different the world would have been. And really, that doesn't even seem relevant. It doesn't even seem like a thought. We barely know what took place. We barely know the people who were alive. I could barely tell you what Queen Elizabeth I did. I just know that there were multiple. This is an instance where 1591 seems like a long time ago. And I want you to imagine something. Right now and currently, 2021, you're doing something every day. And you wake up in the morning and you leave your house and you go do that chore and then you go back to your house and you go to sleep. And you wake up the next day and go and do the same thing and then go back to your house and go to sleep. And you wake up the next day and do it, and that's all you do. And by the way, that's all you've ever done. Oh, and by the way, that's what your parents did. You're just following in the family business. Oh, and yep, your parents did that, so your grandparents did it. And their grandparents also did the exact same thing, and their grandparents also did the exact same thing. You see the significance of this here? If we were in that instance right now and tracked ourselves all the way back to 1591 and said, okay, we're doing the same thing this entire time, I think that we could be in a situation where we sit here and say, you know what? Yeah, we don't like it, but it is what we do. And then maybe, let's say this, and a lot of us were not alive in I say a lot of us, there were some of us who weren't alive in the 1980s. But sometime in the early 1980s, some guy walks in and he says, I'm 40 years old. I'm here to save you from that job you've been doing all your life. How would you react? What would be your response to that guy? He's saying that he's going to rescue you from this, but you've been doing the same thing your parents have been doing, and their parents were doing, and their parents were doing all this time, all the way back to 1591. And you're going to sit there and say, you know what? I'm with you, dude. Let's storm out of this life that we've always known and that our parents have always known and that all our neighbors also know. There's a reason when Moses comes out this first time and says, hello, everyone, I'm here to be your prince and judge, your prince and ruler. That they sat there and said, oh, really? Is that what you're here to do? Mr. Grew up in the palace? The only one who differs from what your family has done? And it wasn't going to be until after Moses has fled to Midian that the children of Israel are going to become so miserable in their bondage, and honestly maybe sparked a little bit by Moses starting something, that they're going to remember God and cry out to Him. They become so comfortable in their bondage that when Moses stands up and says, let's do something about this, they're going to ignore him for the time being. But eventually they couldn't stand it anymore. And it was time to be delivered for them. So we think about what their deliverance looks like, and honestly we could spend hours discussing the beauty of this, and maybe one day we'll get that opportunity to spend hours and hours and hours looking at the beauty of the deliverance of the children of Israel, because it really is beautiful. But from chapter 3 until chapter 12, and for time's sake, we're not going to sit here and read through all of that, even though it would be awesome. Maybe you could do it on your own. From chapter 3 into chapter 12, we're going to see Moses and Aaron going to bat against Pharaoh for the people of Israel, but really they're doing it on the accordance of God. So you have Moses and Aaron, they're going into Pharaoh, God is telling them exactly what to do, God is giving them these miraculous signs, they're going in and they're saying, hey, set the people of Israel free, God wants the people delivered. And they're going to tell Pharaoh that he must let the people of God go, and Pharaoh keeps saying no, and so God is going to proceed to destroy Egypt. One day after another, 1 week after another, each time making something the Egyptians worshipped look foolish. For Israel, the deliverance of God was a removal of the stain of the Egyptians from this earth. It was showing them that even though the Egyptians were high and mighty, the most powerful empire in the world at the time, that they were nothing, and that God could easily deliver the children of Israel had they just called out. And because God, the only God, Pharaoh is going to be in a place where he's finally going to let the Israelites be delivered from their slavery. And the Israelites are going to be delivered eventually to a land that was promised to them. Flip over to chapter 12, and we're going to see Pharaoh sending the children of Israel away. We can hear the misery in his voice, and God has totally flipped the script in a way that almost seems like Pharaoh is just like, deliver me from your misery, right? Pharaoh is sitting here saying, I'm miserable because of you. Get them out of here so I can be delivered from this. Verse 31, then Pharaoh summed up Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And they leave. The Passover takes place. They're led by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And they come to the Red Sea, and when they get to the Red Sea, Pharaoh wants to get hardened his heart, and he says, you know what, we're coming for you. And God opens the Red Sea, splits it in two, and the children of Israel are going to walk through the Red Sea on dry ground in the midst of the ocean. Scholars say that there's a good chance that this split 3 miles wide in order for the amount of Israelites that there would have been to make it across quick enough. And the Israelites are going to walk through the bottom of this ocean on dry ground, with walls of water on either side of them. And as soon as they get through and the Egyptians are thundering behind them on their horses and chariots, God closes the Red Sea and destroys the Egyptians for good, using this water to bury the evil from the life of the Israelites. And the Israelites were finally delivered from bondage. All it took for them to be delivered from bondage was to call out to seek the one deliverer, and he was going to be there. He was going to be the one that was going to deliver them from the evil. And when we think about them, and as they continued on their journey to reach the promised land, we were going to see them go through this journey through the wilderness. And it was going to be difficult. It was not going to be easy. There were a lot of mistakes made. Souls were lost along the way. But that didn't mean God wasn't still there delivering them to the promised land. Still there guiding them, still there feeding them, and keeping them protected. And finally, they were able to make it to the promised land. If you've grown up in church or read the Bible a few times or really just listened to many stories about the Bible, you've probably heard a piece of this story somewhere. This story of God delivering the children of Israel is a famous story because it's such a beautiful story of deliverance from one place to another, from a place of bondage to a place of freedom. And there's this beautiful illustration and this beautiful parallel that takes place with our lives. And we can sit here and say, why do we need to be delivered? See, for the children of Israel, they were very clearly in bondage. They were very clearly trapped in slavery. But we're going to be told that we are a slave to sin. And I can sit here and say, why do we need to be delivered? Well, how long have you struggled with a sin that plagues your life? The one that we just can't seem to get past in order to look like Jesus. The one that we can't get past in order to have a pure heart. And what's difficult is to sit there and think, when did that begin for you? When did that struggle begin? For a lot of us, it's been since we knew what sin was. Whether it's middle school or high school or college or right when you enter the workforce or whatever it may be, it can feel like a long time. Maybe you feel like you're in bondage and it's hard for you to look at God the same way when your marriage begins to suffer and you and your spouse aren't getting along the same way that you did when you first got married. How hard is it to look at God and say, God, you're not delivering me when you go through a tragedy in life? How hard is it sometimes to believe that there's a home past this earth? Why do we need delivered? Because we struggle with things in this life. There's something holding us bondage, and it is challenging. The beautiful thing is that we have been delivered, and I want to ask, what does our deliverance look like? How beautiful is it that we have a Savior that came to earth, God in the flesh? And let that sink in for just a moment. This God who created the universe, this God who destroyed the Egyptians, this God who spoke to the prophets that we see everything written about is going to come to planet Earth, the place He created, and He is going to come to earth simply to deliver us, to die on the cross. He healed, He forgave, He performed miracles, and He ended up dying and raising again. Why? For one reason, so that we might have deliverance. It doesn't matter how long we've been stuck in a miserable place. The Israelites were stuck for 430 years. We could have been stuck since 1591, and that puts us in the same place as the Israelites. And it wouldn't matter, because God delivers us. And when we look at ourselves and say, I want to reach that promised land that you've promised, and we can sit there, and when we pass on from this earth, this super temporary home, we've let our sin be swallowed in baptism, like the Red Sea was going to swallow the Egyptians that were keeping the Israelites bondage. We begin this journey to the promised land. We begin our journey to heaven. And even though the post-swallowing of the sins is, I guess, what we're going to reference it as, even though that post-baptism life is not going to be easy, there are going to be people who are going to lose their way after they've made that decision. God is going to be there the entire time in the same way He was there for the Israelites, delivering them to the promised land where they needed to be, holding our hand and guiding us through the wilderness of life. And He'll do that for us if we choose to seek one deliverance. If we choose to seek the one deliverer who can bring us out of the bondage of sin and the bondage of this earth. Tonight, are you going to choose, or whenever you might be watching this video, are you going to choose to let the deliverer be your God and let Him deliver you from a place of bondage?